Officer Daniel Hayes had been on the force for over 10 years. He'd seen his share of tough situations, drug busts gone wrong, high-speed chases, domestic disputes that spiraled out of control. But nothing had ever shaken him. Until one night in late November, on the outskirts of town, when everything changed. It was just past midnight, and Daniel was sitting in his patrol car, parked in a quiet corner of a desolate industrial district. The air was cold, biting, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows over the cracked pavement. The town had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like something is just about to happen. Daniel was on his usual night shift, watching over a part of town that rarely saw any trouble, mostly old warehouses and closed-down factories. His shift had been uneventful, just how he liked it. Until the call came in. Unit 217, we have a report of a disturbance at the old Murdoch warehouse, 320 Jefferson Road. Could you check it out? Daniel furrowed his brow. The Murdoch warehouse had been abandoned for years. It was one of those places local kids would dare each other to sneak into. Old, decrepit, and filled with rusting machinery. The last time anyone had bothered reporting anything there was years ago, and that had turned out to be nothing but some teenagers causing trouble. He sighed, picked up the radio, and responded. 10-4, dispatch, I'm on my way. As he drove toward the warehouse, the fog thickened, creeping along the ground like fingers reaching out from the earth. The deeper into the industrial district he went, the more isolated it felt. The streetlights grew fewer and farther between, and the once quiet hum of the city seemed to fade into the mist. When Daniel arrived, he parked his car a short distance away from the massive, looming structure. The warehouse looked like something out of a nightmare. Its windows were shattered, and the walls were streaked with rust and grime. The air around it felt heavy, as if the building itself was holding its breath. He could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he approached the entrance. He paused for a moment, hand on his flashlight, staring at the old metal doors. They were slightly ajar, creaking gently in the cold wind. That's when he noticed something that made his stomach tighten, a dark smudge on the ground just outside the door. He knelt down to get a better look. Blood. Not a lot, but enough to suggest that something or someone had been injured recently. Dispatch, I'm at the scene, he muttered into his radio, trying to keep his voice steady. Looks like we might have a situation here. There's blood outside the entrance. 10-4, Officer Hayes. Proceed with caution. Daniel swallowed hard and gripped his flashlight tighter. He pulled his service weapon from its holster and stepped inside the building, the sound of his boots echoing in the vast, empty space. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of rusted machinery, old crates, and debris scattered across the floor. The stench of mildew and rot was overpowering, and the air felt unnaturally cold. His breath fogged up in front of him, and his flashlight beam cut through the dust-filled air. "Hello?" Daniel called out, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "This is Officer Hayes with the police department. If anyone's here, make yourself known." Nothing. Just silence. He moved deeper into the building, his footsteps slow and cautious. Every sound seemed amplified in the empty space, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of a distant rat, the faint drip of water leaking from the ceiling. His heart was pounding in his chest, the kind of fear that creeps in slowly, starting in your gut and spreading like ice through your veins. As he rounded a corner, something caught his eye, a figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the room. "Hey, stop!" Daniel shouted, raising his flashlight and aiming it at the figure. It was a man, tall and thin, his clothes filthy and torn, but something about him wasn't right. He stood unnaturally still, his back to Daniel, his head slightly tilted as if he were listening to something. Daniel took a step forward, keeping his weapon trained on the figure. "Turn around, slowly," Daniel ordered, his voice firm but shaking slightly. The man didn't move, didn't flinch. Daniel's grip tightened on his weapon. His mind raced. Was this guy hurt, or was this some kind of sick game? He took another step forward, his flashlight still trained on the man. And then, with a sudden jerking motion, the man turned. Daniel froze. The man's face was pale, gaunt, with deep sunken eyes that seemed to stare right through him. But it wasn't just his face, it was the way his body moved. It was wrong. Too stiff, too unnatural, like his bones didn't fit inside his skin. And then the smell hit Daniel, a putrid, overwhelming stench of decay. The man's mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, he let out a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl. Daniel took a step back, his heart racing, his mind screaming at him to leave. But before he could react, the man lunged at him, moving with an unnatural speed. Daniel fired his weapon, the gunshots echoing in the cavernous space, but the man didn't stop. He grabbed at Daniel, his hands cold, skeletal, and impossibly strong. Daniel struggled, kicking and pushing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The man's grip tightened, pulling him closer. His face, so close now, was contorted in a grotesque smile, his teeth yellow and rotting. Daniel fired again, this time right into the man's chest, but it was like shooting a corpse. With one final burst of strength, Daniel shoved the man away and ran. His boots pounded against the floor as he sprinted toward the exit, not daring to look back. His breath burned in his lungs and his vision blurred, but he didn't stop. He burst through the warehouse doors, nearly tripping over his own feet as he scrambled toward his patrol car. He could still feel the man's cold hands on him. The image of that twisted, dead face burned into his mind. He slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling fingers. His chest heaved as he gasped for air, his entire body shaking with adrenaline. He grabbed the radio, his voice hoarse and panicked. "Dispatch! I need backup! Now! Something's—" He stopped, choking on his own words. "There's something here." 10-4, Officer Hayes. Backup is on the way. Stay in your vehicle." Daniel stared at the warehouse, half expecting the man to come crashing through the doors. But nothing happened. The night remained eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of his engine. Minutes later, backup arrived. 2 patrol cars, lights flashing, sirens wailing. The other officers searched the building from top to bottom, but they didn't find anyone. No man, no blood, no signs of struggle. But Daniel knew what he had seen, what he had felt. The next day, he learned something that made his blood run cold. The warehouse had a history. Back in the 1970s, a man had been found dead there, his body left to rot for days before anyone discovered it. They said his spirit never left. Some officers had reported strange things over the years, unexplained noises, shadows, feelings of being watched, but no one had ever seen what Daniel had seen. Daniel took a leave of absence after that. He couldn't get the man's face out of his mind, the sound of his growl, the cold touch of his hands. He left the force a few months later. No one ever found out what truly happened that night. But Daniel knew, and he'd never go near that warehouse again. It was the kind of night that clung to your skin, cold, silent, and unnervingly still. I was patrolling one of the oldest, quietest neighborhoods in town. Most of the houses were empty, abandoned by families long gone, leaving behind nothing but broken windows and peeling paint. Even the streetlights seemed tired, flickering weakly, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally long across the cracked pavement. I'd driven this route dozens of times, but that night, something was different. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. My patrol car's engine hummed quietly as I cruised down the empty street, my headlights cutting through the darkness. The radio crackled now and then, but it was just routine check-ins, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Then, I saw him. At the far end of the street, in the middle of the road, there was a figure. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a tree casting a shadow or some debris blown by the wind. But as I got closer, it became clear. It was a man, standing completely still, facing away from me. I slowed the car to a crawl, squinting through the windshield, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. His clothes were strange, torn, dirty, and hanging loosely from his body as if they didn't quite belong to him. His head was bowed, and his arms hung lifelessly at his sides, like a puppet with its strings cut. "Sir, are you all right?" I called out through the window, the sound of my own voice startling me in the quiet. Nothing. He didn't move. He didn't even acknowledge me. My gut twisted into knots. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't just drive off. I was a cop. It was my job to check on him. I pulled the car to a stop a few feet away, the engine idling softly as I reached for my flashlight. My hands were trembling, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Every instinct told me to stay in the car, to drive away and forget I ever saw him. But I couldn't. I stepped out, the night air biting at my skin, and the silence. God, the silence was deafening. "Sir?" I called again, louder this time as I shone the flashlight on him. The beam illuminated his back, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. His clothes looked even worse up close, like they were from another time, decades old, ragged, and covered in grime. The fabric clung to his skeletal frame in a way that made me uneasy. He didn't belong here. I swallowed hard and took a step closer, the sound of my boots on the pavement echoing unnaturally in the empty street. My breath fogged in the cold air, but he remained still, unmoving, unbothered, as if he was frozen in time. I was only a few feet away now, close enough to touch him. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me to stop, to turn around, but I couldn't. I had to make sure he was okay. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before lightly tapping his shoulder. The second my hand made contact, he jerked. Not a normal movement, something more violent, unnatural. His head snapped up, and slowly he began to turn toward me. My flashlight flickered, my heart sank into my stomach. When he finally faced me, my blood ran cold. His skin was pale, too pale, almost translucent in the faint light. His face was gaunt, stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were gone. Just empty, dark sockets where they should have been. But worse than that, far worse, was the smile. His lips were twisted into this grotesque, unnatural grin, stretched wide across his face like he was mocking me, like he knew something I didn't. For a moment, I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the ground as I stared into those hollow sockets, feeling every ounce of blood drain from my face. Then he moved. It wasn't a normal movement, more like a shudder, a sudden jerky motion as he took a step toward me, that smile never leaving his face. A low, guttural sound came from his throat, like a growl, but it wasn't human. It was deep, primal, and filled with something dark, something evil. The noise echoed in the quiet street, sending a wave of pure, paralyzing fear through me. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. That smile. It was burned into my mind, and every second he stood there, it grew wider, more twisted, like he was enjoying my fear. Without thinking, I turned and bolted for the car. I don't even remember getting the door open, but I slammed it shut behind me and fumbled to put the car in gear. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him running after me, but the street was empty, completely empty. I radioed for backup, my voice barely steady enough to make the call. When they arrived, the area was clear. No sign of the man, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been there. Just an empty street, bathed in the faint glow of flickering streetlights. They didn't believe me, of course. They thought I was just tired, that maybe the night had played tricks on me. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. That figure, that thing. It wasn't human. Even now, on nights like that one, when the air feels thick and the darkness feels too heavy, I remember that face. That hollow, empty face. And sometimes, when I'm alone on a quiet street, I swear I can still feel him watching me from the shadows, waiting for me to stop. It was one of those nights, the kind where the cold creeps into your bones and the dark feels heavier than usual. I was on the night shift, quiet, routine. I thought the most I'd have to deal with was a drunk or two, maybe a noise complaint. But around midnight, the call came in. Disturbance at the old Miller house, the dispatcher said, her voice a little shaky. Neighbors reporting screams. The Miller house. Of course, it had to be that place. Even as a rookie, I had heard the stories. The locals called it cursed, a place no one wanted to be near after dark. Strange things happened there. Shadows that moved on their own, objects vanishing and reappearing in odd places, lights flickering even though the electricity had been cut off for years. People always had their stories about it, but I was a cop. I didn't have the luxury of believing in ghost stories. Still, as I drove through the deserted streets, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows of my cruiser, and I couldn't shake this creeping feeling that something was wrong. Really wrong. I arrived at the house, and there it was, standing like a forgotten giant at the edge of town. The moonlight cast a pale glow on its broken windows and rotting wood. The place had been abandoned for years, left to decay after the tragic death of its last owner. But tonight, it wasn't as empty as it looked. The front door was slightly open, swaying ever so gently in the wind. I killed the engine and stepped out of the car, my breath visible in the cool air. The night was eerily quiet. No crickets, no wind, just silence. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I approached the door, my flashlight in hand, and called out, "Police! Is anyone in there?" No answer. But then, from somewhere deep inside the house, I heard a faint noise, a whisper, almost too quiet to hear. It made my skin crawl. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I stepped inside. The door creaked as it opened wider, revealing a dark hallway that stretched out like a mouth, ready to swallow me whole. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the smell of mildew and something else I couldn't place. Something rotten. I scanned the room with my flashlight, the beam bouncing off broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and shattered glass. The house was crumbling, but it was the silence that unnerved me the most. It was like the house itself was waiting, watching. I took a deep breath and called out again, "Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice sounded too loud, echoing in the empty space. Then I heard it, a whisper, this time clearer. It was coming from upstairs. My heart started pounding harder and my throat tightened. There was no logical reason for anyone to be in this house. No power, no running water, nothing but the ruins of a tragic past. Yet someone, or something, was upstairs. I had to go up. It was my job after all. But with each step I took, the creaking of the stairs echoed in the silence, making me feel like I was waking something up. As I reached the top, I noticed a dim light flickering at the end of the hallway. My blood ran cold. How could there be light? There was no electricity in this place. The door to the room was slightly open, just like the front door. From inside, I could hear soft murmurs, like someone talking to themselves. My stomach churned, but I had to see what was going on. I pushed the door open slowly, and that's when I saw her. She stood in the middle of the room, her back to me, swaying ever so slightly. The dim, unnatural light from an old lamp cast long, eerie shadows across the room. Her head was tilted to the side at an unnatural angle, and she was mumbling something under her breath. I couldn't make out the words, but they sounded wrong, twisted, like she was speaking in some language I didn't understand. "Mom?" My voice came out more like a croak. My hand shook as I raised my flashlight. "Are you all right?" She didn't respond. I took a step closer, the floor creaking beneath me. And that's when I saw the rope. She wasn't standing, she was hanging. A noose wrapped tightly around her neck, cutting deep into her pale skin. But her feet, they weren't touching the floor. She was suspended, and yet she was swaying, as if she had only just been hung moments before. But I was alone. No one else could have done this. The air turned cold, colder than outside. I felt it seeping into my skin, freezing me in place. The murmuring stopped, replaced by a sickening silence. And then, without warning, her body twitched. Slowly, impossibly, her head turned toward me, and I saw her face. Her eyes were wide, glassy and lifeless, but her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. My flashlight flickered, the light dimming with every second, and I heard it again. A voice. Not hers, but something else. Something darker. It whispered my name. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, my pulse thundering in my ears. The door behind me slammed shut with a deafening bang. I was trapped. My flashlight went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat. The whispering grew louder, circling me, filling the room. It was all around me. I fumbled for my radio, desperate to call for backup, but all I got was static. And then the voice spoke again, closer this time, almost right next to my ear. It said, "You're next." I bolted. I don't even remember how I found my way back down the stairs, how I got out of that house. My legs moved on their own, driven by pure, primal fear. I sprinted to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The second I slammed the door shut, I sped away without looking back. I reported the incident, of course, but when backup arrived, the house was empty. No body, no sign that anyone had been there at all. They chalked it up to stress, or maybe a prank. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see her face. That twisted smile, those dead eyes. And every now and then, in the dead of night, when everything is quiet and still, I hear it again. That voice, whispering my name.